I'm not billed to speak about the causes of the First World War and to jump into Christopher Clark's shoes. I could have done if you wanted me to, but I think I'm down to speak about the Centenary. And what I should quickly say is what I'm not going to do about that. That is to say, I'm not going to tread on the toes of many of the people you're going to hear later today who will speak about the sort of the practicalities, what is happening at national level, what the plans are, and the developments in particular with which I've been deeply familiar over the last 2 years within the Imperial War Museum and the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. What I thought I'd do instead is just to say, why are we doing this? What's it all about, this centenary? And particularly, to follow up on what Lord Stirrup has already said, to say that this is an opportunity for questioning, for reappraisal, for fresh starts. Indeed, it's got to be that, because if we use this centenary for going back to things we think we already know, it will be boring, unproductive, and repetitious. It'll be particularly boring, unproductive, and repetitious if we're going to do it for 4 years. In fact, I already feel weary, suffering from battle exhaustion at various points when I think about that possibility. There'll be an awful lot of that, I have to say, which is precisely why we must gird ourselves and make sure it doesn't happen. One of the things, and I say that advisedly, because one of the things that strikes me about the run-up to the centenary is how many people think they know, with a great deal of certainty, what people felt about this war when they were fighting it, why they went into this war in the first place, and what its outcomes were. And I've sat through far too many committee meetings on the centenary over the last 2 years, at which I have been told very firmly, not least I have to say, when people have been thinking about this from governmental angles, we must give the public what it wants. One of the things we're pretty sure about is the public hasn't the foggiest idea what it wants, beyond the fact that it wants to be told because it doesn't know, which is precisely why education matters. Education is going to be central to this because people know the First World War is important, that they are certain about, but what they don't know is why it's important, nor do they understand why it broke out, which is where Christopher Clark, of course, comes in, nor indeed what its outcomes were or how contested they were. And the longer I work on this war, and it's taken up a great deal of my working life, the less I know, and the less I'm aware I know, particularly once you start thinking about the experiences. Sorry, am I moving away from the microphone? Can you hear me right at the back? Yeah, good. The more I come to grips with other countries and other countries' experiences, because so often in this country, and I'll come back to this theme again, we get caught up with our own national experience for understandable reasons, without any sense of context or comparison. What we think we know about this war is itself the product of its previous anniversaries and their capacity to shape our understanding. And I think if we realize that, and this is the burden really of what I want to say this morning, then we may approach this centenary with a bit more humility, less certain about the rights and wrongs of the war, and less certain about our own interpretations of it. And I want to focus on the effect of 3 anniversaries in the context of this country's memory and the context of our current perceptions. The anniversary of 1918 itself, the anniversary of 1928 to 32, the 10th anniversary of the end of the war, and the 50th anniversary, the 1964 to 1968 anniversary. A few words first about 1918 itself, about the 11th of November. One of the difficulties that the government's going to confront on the 11th of November 2018 is that that is indeed Remembrance Sunday. It is also Armistice Day. And those two things have sat in uneasy juxtaposition for the last 100 years. Because the Armistice Day was a day of victory, a day of celebration, a day of bell ringing, a day of congratulation. The war had been won. A war which, even in the context of 4 years of experience of it, most people thought still had to be fought and was justified. And of course, it was also a day of commemoration and grieving for all the reasons that we know too well. And those two events, Armistice Day and Remembrance Sunday, have become conflated, both because on the 11th of November they can fall together, but also, of course, because until very recently, we forgot to commemorate Armistice Day when it didn't fall on a Sunday, and Remembrance Sunday took over. I should just say in parenthesis that one of the ways, of course, in 1918 that people resolved that they would address the issue of commemoration, and this is why it's particularly appropriate to mention this in this school, was through education. We too often think that what they did was build war memorials, which indeed they did, and an awful lot of them. My own old school emailed me the other day and said, should we put up another war memorial? And I said, for goodness sake, the one thing you do not need is another war memorial. One in every house, a war memorial chapel. Do you really need that? Think of what they also did, which was think about the education of the next generation. Think about the future. Think about how the experience of this war could be used to create a fresh awareness. Sometimes, of course, a fresh awareness that was designed to enable people to carry on the tradition of military service as much as that of creating a new world. During the 1920s, as a consequence of carrying both the realization of victory and the need to grieve and to commemorate, different interpretations of this war jostled for space against each other. Many of those who commented in the 1920s said, we don't yet fully understand the meaning of this war. We haven't achieved the distance from it to get that meaning. This will require time, and we may eventually get a clearer narrative and a clearer understanding. But right now, we are dealing with many, many different interpretations. And that difficulty of understanding its meaning was exacerbated because, of course, for most countries, many countries, including this country, the war did not end so neatly on the 11th of November 1918. In 1919, Sir Henry Wilson, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, wrote to Lord Esher to say, one war ended a year ago, we're fighting on 20 wars simultaneously at the moment. Wars, of course, across Central and Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, on the frontiers of the former Ottoman Empire, and of course in the empires of the victors across North Africa, in Egypt, Iraq, and on the northwest frontier of India. The war hadn't yet ended, but what had happened instead was the, if you like, smaller, more limited, more localized wars which had attached themselves to the war that broke out within Europe in 1914 were still continuing. By the mid-1920s, publishers were saying the market for books on the First World War has exhausted itself. Those of you who are authors will know that they're wrong, and indeed 2014 is likely to be a moment when a great many people are going to sell a great many books, at least that's what they're hoping. One book which still, interestingly, sold very well in this country in the mid-1920s was Rupert Brooke's collected poetry. And I always like to make that point because Wilfred Owen's collected poetry by then was still struggling to sell copies and certainly hadn't reached four figures in terms of total sales. It was Brooke that encapsulated many people, for many people in this country, what this war was about, not Owen. And I'll come back to that point too, if I get time in a moment. Then in 1928 came the 10th anniversary of the ending of the war. The publishers were proved wrong for the first time, and not the only time, because there was a great flood of books that came out on the 10th anniversary, a flood that ran on into the early 1930s and was characterized in particular by personal accounts, by fictionalized accounts, by war memoirs written from lower ranks rather than from senior ranks. And the most important of those books, without any doubt in terms of its long-term impact, was Erich Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front, which came out in 1928 itself. And the reason that was so important was twofold. First of all, it had a genuinely international impact. It was translated very quickly into many, many languages. And secondly, it became the subject of a Hollywood Oscar-winning film indeed one of the very first talkies ever made, and regularly still shown to countless classes of school children, not least because of its proximity to the war itself in the way in which it was produced. All Quiet on the Western Front is not, in my view, a book about the First World War. It is a book about the generation who fought in that war, who came back from it, having moved from adolescence to adulthood, and then struggled to find a place in the post-war world. That was Remarque's problem. It remained Remarque's problem for the rest of his life. But it was nonetheless a book which shaped popular understandings of the war as futile, a war in which Europeans had fought each other when in reality they were brothers. Think of the moment when Baumer is in the trench or in the shell hole with the wounded Frenchman, and he kills him. And then, of course, there's the moment of compassion and regret after doing so. And, of course, it's a story about how the war shatters the illusion of nationalism, the enthusiasm with which young German schoolboys go off to war, and the realization at the end of it that that may not have been enough to justify what they had been through. But on the other hand, 1928 produced another sort of publication in relation to the war, not one that was initiated ab initio in quite the same way, but one which has had in some ways as much resonance, particularly here in Britain. And that was, I'm stretching a point slightly because the book in question came out not in 1928 but in 1927, and it was Charles Caldwell's life of Sir Henry Wilson, whom I've just mentioned, the Chief of the Imperial General Staff at the end of the First World War. And unlike the other memoirs written by generals in the 1920s, this memoir contained a large number of quotations from Henry Wilson's diary, and was in that respect extraordinarily frank. Caldwell knew what he was about. He was a practiced author. He'd been director of military operations himself in 1914, 1915. And Henry Wilson was deeply politicized. Indeed, as Edward Spears said, seeing a politician was likely to get him in a state of sexual excitement. And he is memorable too, of course, for having, when confronted by an IRA hitman in Eaton Square, somewhat ill-advisedly reaching for his sword rather than opening the door of his house and getting in quickly with fatal consequences. Wilson's life appeared, therefore, posthumously, and it was then seized upon by people like Basil Littlehart as evidence of generals, how they behaved, and how they were incompetent. This has become a British trope in relation to the study of the First World War, which has never found comparable reflection in other countries. And Littlehart is one of its principal authors. Lloyd George, of course, and Littlehart helped Lloyd George write his memoirs. Lloyd George perpetuated that argument when he cashed in with his own memoirs in the 1930s. In Germany and France, generals were also chateau-bound. Generals also conducted offensives which did not necessarily end gloriously and which did not avoid enormous casualties. But they have escaped, broadly speaking, the comparable literature that has embraced this country, which is so concerned with the butchers and bunglers of the Western Front. And it's interesting that from 1927, 1928, and I think I'm right in dating it from there, our notion of generalship in this country has both narrowed to that of Britain alone and has also lost any sense that these generals were necessarily great heroes. And I, to make that point, highlight the position of Marshal, beg his pardon, Foch, whom John Buchan, when he completed his History of the Great War, which he wrote while the war was going on, described as the one truly great general that this war produced. A man feted in London when he came for the Victory Parade, a man whose statue stands by Victoria Station, and I'm delighted to say the French government is about to refurbish it, but a man who's almost entirely been lost from view in our understanding of who won this war. The Second World War disrupted the narrative of the First World War in two senses. First of all, what the Second World War did was trump, particularly, of course, for Germany and Russia, trump the memory of the First World War. This was a far more awful conflict with far greater loss of life than had been the First World War. It was also a longer war. And for Germany and Russia, it is the war that defines the memory of war. It is the war that encapsulates what war is. That hasn't happened, if we view from the war from the perspective of 2013, to the same extent here in Britain, or for that matter in France. In the case of Britain, the casualties in the First World War, the death rate in the First World War was twice as high as it was in the Second World War, an unusual experience among the belligerents in both world wars. It also trumped the memory of the other thing that happened, the way in which that memory has been interpreted in this country, has been that we decided after the Second World War to load the memory of both world wars onto the 11th of November. And the effect of that up to this day has been that the 11th of November, the end of the First World War, has had to carry the burden of commemoration and remembrance for all wars that we have fought since then, in a way that has not applied to some other countries. It is being confirmed that that is the consequence by the way in which, of course, victory in the Second World War was taken away from the 11th of November and put in the dates that it belonged to. That is to say, April and May. Metaphorically, no, literally, it was moved from the winter to the summer. So VE Day, VJ Day, carried victory, and the 11th of November was simply left carrying commemoration. I haven't expressed that quite as clearly as I meant to, but I hope the point is clear. The role of the Second World War also was to become the good war, the war for the ideology of liberal democracy, the war against fascism, the war justified and increasingly justified by the Holocaust. The view that saw the Second World War as the good war had, in some respects, the effect of making the First World War the bad war. The Second World War was the necessary war. The First World War somehow became the unnecessary war. That seems to me deeply paradoxical, because the First World War can also be seen as a justified war, a war fought for over ideological difference, a war for liberal values against the values of a regime that was seen as clearly militarized in this country. The image of the Kaiser with his helmet and his upturned moustache, a view that it was a military occupation that was terrorizing northern France and Belgium. It was also, of course, a war seen as justified in humanitarian terms after the atrocities committed in Belgium in 1914. And it was a war increasingly fought for the ideals of the United States, of manifest destiny, of liberal democracy, once the United States entered the war in 1917. So the rhetoric that Roosevelt and Churchill used to justify the Second World War echoed the Wilsonian rhetoric of 1917-1918. The First World War was forgotten after the Second World War until 1964. The view that we now have of the First World War is above all, I think, shaped by that anniversary, the 50th anniversary, even more than it was shaped by the 1918 commemoration or by the 10th anniversary. One of the reasons the 50th anniversary was so powerful was that it was marked by new methods of mass communication. We are, of course, concerned with the role that the internet will play in how we commemorate the centenary. In 1964, the BBC launched what was really the first great historical documentary on television. It doesn't conform or match the standards that we would now expect of historical documentaries, but it was trailblazing in its day. It did all sorts of things that were wildly improper. Footage is used from all the wrong periods and all the wrong places. The Germans always have to attack from right to left, and the British and the French from left to right, because we know, of course, that's what the Western Front looks like. It was, to that extent, misleading. The great voices were those of Lloyd George, played by, who did play Lloyd George? Emily Williams, I think, and Haig. I mean, these voices of Rafe Richardson, Michael Redgrave, and so on, who provided the narrative. It also interviewed the veterans while they were still alive. It gave them a voice which they had lost between 1939 and 1945, and gave a moment for them to express what they had to say. Another great technological innovation, and again, it's hard to imagine now because we've become so used to it, was the Sunday Times colour supplement. Colour supplements appeared with the Sunday papers for the first time at the moment of the centenary, and the Sunday Times colour supplement devoted successive issues to the centenary, to the 50th anniversary of the First World War. Now, I'd like to highlight two aspects of that 64 to 68 centenary, with which I think we're still living, in part because they picked up the tropes of 1928, they picked up Remark on the one hand, and Cornwall's Life of Henry Wilson on the other. The first, of course, is Joan Littlewood's Oh, What a Lovely War, produced in 1964. I saw the original production in the Edinburgh Festival in the Assembly Hall. Wonderful it was, and truly vibrant, truly exciting. I was then how old was I? 14, and it used the songs of the First World War. Those of you who've only seen the film really can't understand, I think, what the impact of the original production was. But of course, crucially, satirizing the war and satirizing the generals, confirming that image, if you like, of butchers and bunglers, and the notion that the war was futile and wasteful. And on the other hand, the response to that, and in particular, the publication of John Terrain's biography of Haig, the educated general, John Terrain, who'd worked on the BBC Great War series, who finally took up the challenge which had been perpetuated by Little Hart, who was still alive, had been perpetuated by Little Hart ever since the 1930s, and had been shaped by Little Hart, particularly through his influence on Alan Clark when he wrote a book called The Donkeys, and on Leon Wolfe, who wrote a book on the Third Ypres battle called In Flanders Fields. And of course, what John Terrain was anxious to do was, and the title suggested it, to make the case for Haig and to argue that here was a general contending with very difficult circumstances, leading an army that, as we now describe it, goes through a learning curve on the Western Front and comes out victorious at the end. That indeed, for the first time and only time in Britain's military history, that the British Army fights the main battle against the main enemy in the main theatre of war. I can't buy into all that, I'm afraid. The French and the Americans are on the Western Front too. This is a coalition effort, but the point nonetheless needed to be made. And it is a theme which others, particularly Gary Sheffield, in his book on Forgotten Victory, have continued to this day. 2014-2018 gives us an opportunity to break out of that debate. If we simply go back, and there are moments when I think we are going to go back, to an argument that says, on the one hand, this war is futile and wasteful, and on the other hand, that says we produce an army that does wonderfully well on the Western Front, then we will be going round and round in circles still in 2018. What we need to do as we approach 2014, and what we need to do if we're teaching, I teach in universities, most of you teach in schools, is to raise questions, because questions are the essential preliminary to any satisfactory answers. This is the point where the politicians get cross with me because they want answers. I'm an academic and I can duck that. My point is that 2014 is about uncertainty because 1914 was about uncertainty. Nobody knew in 1914 what this war was going to be like. Nobody knew what the outcomes would be. Nobody knew individually whether we'd have the courage to meet the challenge that would confront them. 2014 is a moment to confront those sort of questions in a broader and more generic sense. It is, after all, the year in which British troops will also withdraw from Afghanistan. And that, too, will raise questions like, when is it right to go to war? And why should we fight? For what should we fight? Those questions which the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have raised for our generation were exactly the questions that Britons asked themselves in July and August 1914, with a similar degree of seriousness, and they responded to them with a similar degree of conscientiousness. Not till 2018 will we have a sense of what the answers to those questions will be, and perhaps even then we won't have the answers because these are inherently intractable problems. But I hope that if we do approach the centenary in a sense of questioning, then we shall have developed a greater public understanding, which is what the centenary provides us the opportunity to create. These, after all, these bigger questions are the questions which we associate with all wars, as are many of the other debates which we almost exclusively load onto the First World War. I said just now that Wilfred Owen didn't sell many copies in the 1920s. Wilfred Owen, when I was at Rugby in the 60s, was then being widely read. And why was it being widely read? Because Benjamin Britten had, of course, set Owen to music for the War Requiem, and because the Vietnam War generated fresh questions about war and its purpose. Owen didn't just talk about the First World War. Dulciet decorum est was, after all, the old lie. He was referring to Horace, and he was addressing war as a generic phenomenon as much as the First World War specifically. And that is precisely where much of this will fit. In relation to the First World War specifically, I hope that by 2018 we will have raised our eyes from the performance of the British Army, British generals, and what they do on the Western Front, to a reappreciation of the First World War as a global phenomenon. I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not saying we should forget the victories of the British Army in 1918, but we need to move beyond them. And secondly, we need to realize the scale of this war for the Balkans, for Russia, for the Ottoman Empire, elements of this war which barely impinge on our consciousness. And if we realize the role of the First World War in shaping the world, then we will perhaps have a greater grasp in realizing the role of the war in still shaping the world in which we live. This, after all, was the war in which the United States entered the world stage for the first time, equipped with the rhetoric which we still use in relation to the wars which we fight. This, after all, is the war which some historians will see as the war that inaugurates the Cold War, the moment when the United States sets itself in ideological opposition to Bolshevism. And this, after all, is the war in which the problems of the Middle East, which is the most likely source of conflict in the world today, at least on a major scale, where the problems of the Middle East find their origins. And perhaps most importantly, this is the war where we can recognize the modernity of our own ideas, the ideas and their ideas, the point where we overlap. Lord Stewart referred just now to Hartley and the war and the past being another place, L.P. Hartley's line. And in some senses, of course, 1914 does feel like another place because it's a world of emperors, cabinet government, and apparently a lack of popular mobilization. By 1918, this is a war and a world in which empires have fallen, emperors have gone, and popular mobilization is central to sustaining the war. The ideologies and values of that society have changed, of those societies, have changed dramatically and reflect much, much more those of our own days. Essentially, the point is that we judge the past from where we ourselves sit. How we see the First World War in 2018 will be different, should be different, from how they saw the First World War in 1918 or in 1968. Thank you very much.